Okay, welcome back. This is now part 2 of our 3-part video training series on being a poll worker on Election Day for the City of Lowell. So in part 2, we're going to be going over how you're going to be processing voters and ballots on Election Day itself after you've completed the setting up of your polling location and you've opened the polls on Election Day at 7 o'clock in the morning. So the first thing that I'd like to teach you is how a voter typically votes in a Massachusetts election. And I like to refer to it as the voting cycle. And the reason I teach how a voter typically votes in Massachusetts is that if you understand the basic cycle and the process of how a voter typically votes, when something changes in that cycle, such as in this upcoming election due to COVID-19, you're going to understand the reasons for those differences and how you can respond appropriately to the voters coming in. So, let's go over how a voter typically votes in a Massachusetts election. Let's say, for example, I'm a voter and I come up to my polling location, and let's say I have a made-up address. When I get to the polling location, the first thing I, the voter, needs to do is go to the check-in table. At the check-in table, there are going to be 2 inspectors, and both of those inspectors are going to have Part 1 and Part 2 of the check-in books. And again, these are what the check-in books look like, and this is a check-in book from a previous election. So if we open up the check-in book, you'll see that all of the voters that are registered to vote in your precinct are listed by address and by name. So when a voter comes up to your check-in table, they're going to identify themselves by their name and their address. Hi, my name is Elliot Veloso. I live at, let's say, 1 Washington Street, and I'd like to vote. So the inspectors are going to go through these check-in books, and they're going to find the voter by their address and by their name, and they're going to check the voter in before they're given a ballot. So, using a ruler that comes with your kit, you'll go through the book, find that voter's address, and then once you find that voter's address, you're going to scroll down the book until you find the voter's name. So for instance, let's say this was the voter's name. So once you find the voter's name and address, you then need to repeat the voter's name and address back at the voter. And this is a way of confirming that the voter is who they say they are and that the address is correct in the book. So in this instance, okay, you are Elliot Veloso and you live at 1 Washington Avenue. Is that correct? The voter says yes. Then taking a red pencil in your kit, you're going to go into your check-in book, and next to the box where the voter's name is, you're going to mark it with a red X. This mark indicates that you've checked that voter in, and so that voter is ready to receive a ballot. So, once you've checked the voter in, you hand the voter their ballot, and the voter takes that ballot and goes into one of the voting booths. They then mark their ballot with a black pen, and then in Massachusetts, what the voter needs to do before they can deposit their ballot is they need to check out. So the voter then goes to a checkout table where there are 2 inspectors with an identical copy of these books. Instead, they're checkout books. And then the voter again identifies themselves by their name and address. At the checkout table, the inspectors again go through the books, find the registered voter's address and finds their name, and again says the voter's name and address out loud to confirm it. And once the voter confirms it, taking a red pencil, they go into the book, they mark the red box, checking out the voter, and then the voter can take their ballot and deposit it into the AutoMark voting machine. So that's essentially the process. That's a way a voter typically votes in a typical Massachusetts election. They check in, they get their ballot, they check out, and they deposit their ballot in the machine. So now that you know the way a voter typically votes in a Massachusetts election, let's go over the differences in this voting cycle. And there are 2 ways these differences are going to come up. The first set of differences is going to be the fact that this is a Massachusetts state presidential election. And there are also going to be differences in the voting cycle caused by COVID-19 and how to deal with the impacts and the health implications of that. So let's start first with the changes in the voting cycle due to the fact that this is a Massachusetts state and presidential election. Now, for many poll workers, you may have worked in the previous election, which was the state primary. And in the state primary, you had 4 different ballots, one for 4 different political parties, Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, and you had to note either the political party or their preference in the book. Well, good news, everyone who worked the primary in September, you don't have to worry about that for November. And the reason for that is that because this is a state and presidential election, there's only one ballot. And every voter will get that ballot, regardless of their political party or affiliation. So unlike in primaries, you do not need to mark the political party of an independent voter when they're checking in. So that doesn't matter. Again, you don't have to be concerned about a registered voter's political party. If they're registered to vote, everyone gets the same ballot. The bad news, and I don't know if I necessarily call it bad news, but it's something you've got to keep in mind, is that for the state presidential election, even though there's one ballot, it's a 2-paged ballot, double-sided. So, and the heading of the ballot is going to be in yellow. So here is a training example of the ballot that you're going to be using for the November election. So again, it's 2 pages double-sided. So let's go to page 1. If you look at page 1 is going to contain all of the races and the candidates for the race. If we flip to the back of page 1, you'll see that the back of page 1 contains ballot question number 1. Then if we go to page 2, you'll see on the front of page 2, you'll see ballot question number 2. Now, if you're working in 17th or 18th Middlesex District, that's all the ballot questions. So you're going to have 2 pages double-sided on the first page and 1-sided on the second. If you are working in 16th Middlesex District, so that means you're in wards 5, 6, or 9, on the second page, you're also going to have a small ballot question on the back. This is question 3, and it deals with renewable energy. But this only applies to 16th Middlesex District. So the best way to remember it is that it's a 2-page ballot, double-sided, and every voter gets both pages. So, inspectors, when you are checking voters in and you're handing them the ballot, remember to tell the voter when you give them the ballot, here's your ballot. Remember, it's 2 pages double-sided. So that way, it reminds the voter when they receive the ballot, oh, it's a 2-page ballot and it's double-sided. I better check both sides when I look at my ballot. Now, the ballot is trilingual in English, Spanish, and Khmer. So you can see it right here, English, Spanish, and Khmer. And the instructions on how to turn things over are also in English, Spanish, and Khmer. So you'll see the ovals on the first page next to the candidates where they're going to need to mark their ballot. And then if you look at the ballot questions, I'll use this as an example, this is where the voter is going to mark their ballot questions, yes and no, along this side. Okay? So, again, this is your ballot. 2 pages, double-sided, and every registered voter gets it, no matter what political party they belong to. The final major thing you've got to keep in mind with the state presidential election is that Lowell is divided into 3 different legislative districts. And your state representative can depend on which district you live in or are registered to vote in. Again, 16th Middlesex District, 17th Middlesex District, and 18th Middlesex District. So as a result of that, the ballots aren't interchangeable. So you can't use a ballot, say, that works in Ward 1, Precinct 1, and just simply move it over to Ward 12 or Ward 11. And so when you are looking at your ballots and setting up in the morning, you should double check to make sure that the ballots you have at your ward and precinct are the correct ballots that the machine will be able to take, because they're programmed to only accept the ballots that they're programmed for your ward and precinct. So how can you tell that? Well, just look at your ballot. If you look at the corner of your ballot, you'll see that it lists the wards that the ballot is good for. So for this ballot, we see that this ballot can be used in wards 5, 6, and 9. Now, we double check these ballots before we send them out to your wards and precincts, but it doesn't hurt to double check before you open up the polls. So that way, if there's an error, if something came up and you have the wrong ballot, we can send out the correct ballots to you in time. So, those are the major changes in the voting cycle due to the fact that this is a state presidential election. Now let's go over the differences in the voting cycle due to the fact that we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, because we are in the middle of a pandemic, the Massachusetts state legislature has made certain changes to voting procedures that municipalities can do to help keep voters and poll workers safe. And some of those changes has affected the voting cycle. So, let's go over them. The first major change that COVID-19 has done to the voting cycle is that Massachusetts municipalities for the elections in 2020 are permitted to get rid of their checkout tables for voters. So as a result, all a voter needs to do is check in at their polling location. So the way this changes, and this is the way it's going to be for the election in November, is that when a voter comes into your polling location, they're going to check in at your check-in table, and you follow the same procedure. You find the voter in the book, you say out their name and address out loud, you mark them in with a red pencil, and you give them the ballot. And then, after the voter goes into the voting booth and makes their selections, instead of going to a checkout table, they're going to go straight to your AutoMark machine and deposit the ballots into the AutoMark machine. And the reason we're doing that is that it helps us avoid the potential exposure risk to having another line in the middle of your voting area. So instead of having another potentially long line at your checkout table where voters are checking out again, Massachusetts has allowed us to eliminate that second line and eliminate that checkout table. So we're taking advantage of that for the November election. So again, when a voter comes into your polling location, they're only going to be checking in. And then, once they finish marking the ballot, they're going to go straight to the AutoMark machine and deposit their ballot. So, you should always have a poll worker either around your AutoMark machine or monitoring the AutoMark machine to make sure that when voters are finished marking their ballot, they go straight to the AutoMark machine, the AccuVote machine, and they deposit their ballot in the machine. Okay? You want to make sure of that. So you should always have a poll worker monitoring your AccuVote machine to make sure that the ballots are going in. The next major change due to COVID-19 is that we are going to be having mandatory personal protective equipment requirements. So all of your precincts are going to be assigned a PPE kit, and this is provided by the state. And this PPE kit contains personal protective gear that you can use during the November election. So it's going to contain face masks for all of the poll workers. It's going to have gloves that all the poll workers can use. It's going to have a bottle, an individual bottle of hand sanitizer assigned that can be given and used for the day by each poll worker. There's also going to be a large bottle of hand sanitizer for voters who are checking in to be able to use before they get their ballot or handle anything. There's going to be guides and signs in the kit so that voters can read it and understand the safety procedures relative to protecting themselves from COVID-19. There's also going to be disinfectant wipes in your PPE kits. So you can use those disinfectant wipes to wipe down high-contact surfaces throughout the day. And you should have a poll worker with gloves and PPE equipment wiping down common surfaces throughout the day. Wiping down the AccuVote machine, wiping down your check-in table, wiping down some of your voting booths, and also cleaning your pens. So, in addition to the equipment that the state is providing, the city has supplemented this PPE equipment with equipment of our own that we're also giving to you. We're in the process of purchasing face shields so that each poll worker can use a face shield as well as a face mask while they're working the polls. We have plexiglass barriers that are going to be set up at our check-in tables so that there's a barrier between the voter who's checking in and the poll worker who's processing that voter with the check-in books and giving them the ballot. We're also going to be buying extra face masks. So if a voter comes in and doesn't have a face mask, you can offer them a face mask so that they can wear it during the voting process. Additionally, we're also looking to get some additional PPE equipment to help with the polling location. As well, in order to help maintain social distancing, we're also going to be including a roll of painter's tape in with your kit, so you can use this painter tape to mark out the floor for 6 feet apart. We included duct tape in the kits in the September primary, only to discover that we couldn't use the duct tape on certain floors because it would damage the floors. So for the election of November, we're going to be including a roll of painter's tape that you can use to mark out 6 feet apart and encourage social distancing. So, as a result, all poll workers are going to be required to wear either a mask or a face shield if they can't wear a mask when they're working the polls, or if they can't be more than 6 feet apart from each other. This is a mandatory requirement. So if you fail as a poll worker to wear a mask or a face shield if you can't wear a mask at your polling location when you're working the polls, it will be grounds for dismissal. Okay? This is a mandatory requirement. Now, we strongly recommend that if you're wearing a mask, you also wear a face shield, which we're providing it. But we understand that there are certain poll workers, due to health reasons, that they can't wear the mask, but they can wear the face shield. So we understand that. But it's mandatory that all poll workers have to wear a mask when they're working the polls, or a face shield if they can't wear a mask. If you fail to comply with this, you will be asked to leave, and you won't be paid for the election. Okay? This is a mandatory requirement to keep you safe and to keep voters safe. Now, in addition to the protective gear requirement, voters should also, when they're lining up at your polling locations, maintain a social distance of 6 feet apart while in line. So again, we've included painter's tape in the kits so that you can help mark that out. A question has also come up as to how can we maintain social distancing inside the voting area? And the ultimate answer for that is that it depends on your polling location. So all poll workers should maintain awareness of how it's going in your polling location. If you have a couple of voters in your voting area and they have enough space to maintain social distancing, but if you start letting more voters in, that's going to make it an issue, hold up the voters in the line, have them wait until you process those voters in your voting area, and once they leave, then you can let more voters in. Or alternatively, you can use the painter's tape and you could try to mark out certain voting booths to try to maintain social distancing inside your polling location. How you approach the issue of maintaining social distance at your polling location is up to your discretion because, again, the configuration of each polling location may be different. We've tried to set up and design our polling locations to maintain good flow so that voters come in, they vote, and then they leave a certain way. But sometimes that's just not possible at certain polling locations. So again, you're going to have to monitor your polling location, and you're going to have to see what works and what doesn't work and adjust accordingly as the voters are coming in and being processed. Now, I mentioned there's going to be a hand sanitizer pump at your check-in table that all voters can use, and we encourage them to use it. If a voter uses the hand sanitizer pump, however, wait until the voter's hands are dry before you give them a ballot. The reason for that is that if the voter's hands are wet, when they handle the ballot, they're going to warp it. And if they warp the ballot, when they try to feed it in through the AccuVote machine is not going to read it, and it's going to reject the ballot because the ballot's warped because of the hand sanitizer. So if a voter uses hand sanitizer, we encourage them to do so, but wait until their hands are completely dry until you give them the ballot. So I recommend vigorous rubbing. That helps dry the hands. Okay? Now, again, we also mentioned that voters should use the hand sanitizing wipes that are included in your kits to wipe down high contact areas throughout the day. What we're also including is 2 pen containers for each polling location. One pen container will be at your check-in table, and one pen container will be at your AccuVote machine. So what that means is that voters can take a clean pen, they can take it with them, mark their ballot in the voting booth, and then when they're inserting their ballot into the AccuVote machine, they can put their used pen into that container. So a poll worker can then just simply take out a disinfectant wipe down the pens, and put it back in the clean container in the check-in table. So that's another option you can use to help keep your pens clean. Now, The next change due to COVID-19 is the issue of voters wearing masks. Now, voters are going to be strongly encouraged to wear masks prior to the election and on election day. However, we can't stop a voter from voting if they refuse to wear a mask. Everyone has a fundamental and constitutional right to vote. So even if a voter isn't wearing a mask, we can't deny them the right to vote. But what we can do is we can institute procedures in place to help protect that voter, as well as poll workers and other voters while that maskless voter is voting. So here's the procedure that we are going to be implementing, and we implemented it in the primary, and we're doing the same in November election. Each polling location is going to have one isolation table. This isolation table is going to be in the corner of your polling location away from the other precincts. If a voter comes in and doesn't have a mask on, and you're checking them in, the poll workers are going to offer that voter a mask. That's why we in the city are purchasing extra masks, so that if you have a maskless voter, you can offer them a mask. Hopefully, the voter will accept it. It'll be, oh, gee, I forgot my mask in the car. Great, thank you very much. And that's the end of it. But if you have a voter that says, yeah, I'm not wearing the mask either for personal reasons or for medical reasons, once you check that voter in, a poll worker is going to give the voter their ballot, and then they're going to escort that voter to the isolation table. Once at the isolation table, the voter is going to be left alone, given their privacy, and they're going to mark their ballot at the isolation table. Once the voter is done marking their ballot at the isolation table, they're going to raise their hand. And then the poll worker is going to come to that voter, and they're going to observe the AccuVote machine for a time when it's clear. Once it's clear, the poll worker is going to escort the voter to the AccuVote machine so the voter can insert their ballot and deposit their pen. And that's going to be the procedure for maskless voters. We're going to have an isolation table set up so that the voter isn't being denied the right to vote, but they're going to be isolated from other voters so that they can vote safely. Now, if you have a situation where a voter is insisting that they're not going to go to the isolation table, inspectors, get your wardens and clerks over. Don't escalate the situation. Just calmly inform the voter, I'm sorry, if you're not going to wear a mask, this is the way the procedure is going to be. You're just going to vote at the isolation table. If the voter, again, is disruptive, refuses to do it, wardens and clerks, get your officer over, and again, try to de-escalate the situation, but tell the voter firmly, I'm sorry, if you're not going to wear a mask, you can vote, but you're going to have to vote at the isolation table. If they continue to be disruptive of the election, you're going to ask them to leave. And again, if the situation keeps escalating, you're going to have to get the officer involved, and the officer will either escort them out or arrest them. So that's the procedure that's going to be in place. There's going to be an isolation table. Maskless voters are going to be permitted to vote, but they do it at the isolation table. Now, if there are multiple maskless people voters that are going to be voting, they're going to have to wait in line at the isolation table 6 feet apart. And also, with the isolation table, let's be reasonable when it comes to certain voters. So if you have a maskless voter that comes in with their child, and let's say for medical reasons they can't wear a mask, obviously don't break up the family. Don't tell the child, okay, you're waiting in the corner while the mother goes to vote alone. Let's be reasonable. So obviously if the maskless voter comes with a family unit, we're not going to be breaking up the family unit. Another example could be you have an elderly voter who for medical reasons cannot wear a mask, and they come with, let's say, their grandchild who's going to help them with the voting. Obviously, we're not going to be breaking that family up. They're going to be allowed to go to the isolation table together so the grandchild can help the grandparent, okay? Again, this isolation table is designed so that we can accommodate those maskless voters while still making sure that everyone can vote safely and efficiently. The final change that I want to discuss in regards to the differences caused by COVID-19 is early voting and absentee ballots. Now, further on in part 2, we're going to get into processing early voting and absentee ballots. But due to COVID-19, Massachusetts is permitting all registered voters, regardless of whatever their motivation or reason, to vote by mail in the November election. And there are many voters in the city of Lowell who are taking advantage of this option. As such, the city is anticipating we're going to get quite a lot of vote-by-mail ballots or absentee ballots from voters who just don't want to risk going to the polls in person on election day. So in light of the fact that you're potentially looking at thousands of early voting and absentee ballots that we're going to need to process, Massachusetts is permitting all municipalities, should they wish, to process any mail-in or absentee ballots they receive prior to Election Day. The state is allowing us to process and count those ballots before Election Day. So up to 6 days, in fact, prior to Election Day. So what this means is that before Election Day on November 3rd, the city is going to designate a day when we're going to take whatever early voting and absentee ballots we've received, and we're going to process them just as if we were processing them on Election Day. So it'll be publicly noticed, open to the public, and poll workers are going to process all of these absentee and early voting ballots as if it was on Election Day. So they'll take out one, they'll identify the voter's name and address, take it out of the envelope, check the voter in, and feed it through a machine that's set up for early ballot processing. And so they'll process these ballots just like it would be on Election Day. And once they go through all the early voting and absentee ballots for a precinct, they're going to finish it up, finish marking the check-in books, and they're going to generate an early voting ticker tape result. So it'll be printed out, 3 copies, just like it would be on Election Day. And they're going to process any hand counts or write-ins that they had to do during this early processing day. So you'll have your own tally sheet for that. What this means for you on Election Day is that on Election Day, you're not going to need to process all of those early voting and absentee ballots that were processed before Election Day. Because again, we've already processed them, we've already checked them in, we've already counted them. So that's good. Instead, what you're going to receive on Election Day is the ticker tape and the hand and write-in tally sheets from that early voting processing day. So at the end of the night, when you're processing your ballots, you need to remember to add the results from that early ballot processing day from the ticker tape and your tally sheets. Okay? So again, we're going to be doing early processing for our absentee and early voting ballots. So on a day prior to Election Day, we're going to process all of those ballots that we received by mail, or as many as we can. Thus, on Election Day, you're not going to be getting those ballots. Instead, you'll be receiving a ticker tape and the tally sheets from that early ballot processing day. And you're going to need to add those results to whatever ballots you process on Election Day. Okay. Hope that makes sense. So, those are the major changes to the voting cycle due to COVID-19. So, now that we've gone over these major changes and you understand how a voter is going to be processed on Election Day, I want to now go over some common scenarios that you may run into with voters as you're processing them through Election Day. And these are situations where the voting cycle changes. So that's why I teach the voting cycle, so that once you're aware of how a voter typically votes, when something changes, when something shifts, you'll know how to deal with the situation. And the most common way to deal with these situations, inspectors, is that if you run into this situation, call your warden and clerk over, because they're going to be the ones who are going to process this voter and deal with this unique circumstance. Remember the common rules. Keep calm, follow instructions, and work the problem. Okay, so the first common situation that you may run into on Election Day is that you're processing ballots, the voter finishes marking their ballot after they were checked in, they go to the AccuVote machine, they insert their ballot, but the ballot doesn't go in. You may run into situations where the ballot, for whatever reason, doesn't go into the machine. If you run into that situation, you, the poll worker, should do everything in your power to get this ballot to be read by this machine. So, now obviously you don't want to force it, but again, if you have a ballot that doesn't go in, you should try everything in your power to make sure that this machine can read this ballot. So, step one, what do you do? Well, if the ballot is rejected by the machine, it could be that the ballot is bent, or there might be a crease somewhere that is hindering the ballot going in the machine. So, what you do, flatten your ballot out, take a ruler in the kit, and flatten out your ballot. Try to make it as flat as possible. And then insert it into your machine. If it still isn't going to the machine, Try inserting it another way. Remember, the scanner is omnidirectional, and it'll read the ballot no matter how you insert it. So again, if it doesn't go in this way, try this way. If that doesn't work, try flipping it over. Try doing it this way. Another thing to remember, this is a 2-page ballot, but you need to insert the sheets one at a time. So if a voter comes in with both sheets together and tries inserting it, the machine isn't going to accept it because it's 2 ballots at once. So when you insert the 2-page ballot, remember to insert the pages one at a time. And that way the machine will read it. Now, if that still doesn't work, you may have a situation where there's something wrong on the ballot. So check your LCD screen. If the machine rejects the ballot and you get a message that says overvote, that means that on this ballot that the voter marked, there was some race or some ballot question where the voter overvoted on the race. So in many instances, you can only vote for one, but they voted for more than one. So, for example, let's say in the presidential race on this ballot, and I'll use the sample ballot as an example. Let's say a voter voted for Biden and Harris and also voted for Trump and Pence. Well, you can only vote for one in this race. So that's going to be deemed an overvote. So when the machine reads the ballot, it's going to reject the ballot saying, oh, overvote. So when that happens, either ask the voter, says you have an overvote, please examine your ballot and see if there's an overvoted race. Or if the voter permits you, you can take a look at the ballot. And then you look at the ballot, I see right here, you voted for Biden and Harris as well as Trump and Pence. You can't do that. You can only vote for one. 9 times out of 10, it's a simple mistake. A voter got confused or thought they were marking another race when they accidentally marked the original race. So mistakes happen. That's fine. So if a voter says, oh, geez, yeah, I did overvote. I'm really sorry. I thought I was voting for another one. That's fine. What you're going to do is that you're going to take a ballot marker, and in the ballot that was overvoted and incorrect, you're going to write spoil on it, S-P-O-I-L. So you're going to spoil that ballot. You're then going to take that spoiled ballot, and you're going to insert it into the spoiled ballot envelope. And here it is right here. So you insert it in the spoiled ballot envelope. You then give the voter a new ballot. They mark their ballot correctly, hopefully this time. And then they're going to insert it into the voting machine. Now, something to keep in mind. Remember, this is a 2-page ballot. So you may run into a situation where a voter inserts one page of their 2-page ballot, and that goes in fine, but they insert the second page, and that's rejected. So if that happens, remember, they're only getting the page that was rejected. They're not getting both ballots again because one of their ballots went through. So, again, remember to keep that in mind. Hopefully, if you run into the situation, it's the first page that was rejected, in which case you can spoil both ballots and give them a brand new 2-page ballot. But in those situations where one page goes in but the other page doesn't go in, remember, if you're spoiling that second page, the voter only gets the second page. Okay? Now, what happens if you run into a situation where the voter says, well, I know I voted for more than 2 people. I want to vote for more than 2 people in this race. Oh, so you want to purposefully overvote? Yes. Okay, well, you can try to convince the voter that you can't purposefully overvote, but let's say the voter's insistent and they want to overvote in that race. Or it could be a situation where, say, you're processing an early voting or absentee ballot and someone accidentally overvoted in that ballot. But because the person's not there, you have to accept the ballot as is. So in those situations where you have to process an overvote, you can override the machine so that the ballot will be accepted. So wardens and clerks, call over your police officer, get your key, open up the security flap, and expose the 2 buttons. You're going to hold down the yes button. And as you hold down the yes button, you're going to insert the ballot. This overrides the voting machine. And thus, the ballot goes through and is processed. Now remember, even though you are overriding the machine, just because you're overriding the machine to accept the overvoted ballot, it doesn't mean that the overvoted race is going to count. The machine is not going to count that race that was overvoted, even if you insert it into the machine through the override procedure. What the machine is going to do, though, it's going to count every other race that was voted correctly. So, again, if you override, even though the overvoted ballot is going in, it's not going to count the overvoted race. So if you think that might be helpful to tell the voter, if they're insisting they want to overvote, you can let them know, look, I can override this and we can put your ballot in, but it's still not going to count your overvoted race. But if the voter says, no, I insist, my principles are, all right, fine, here, override, in it goes. And again, if you're dealing with early voting or absentee ballot processing and a person accidentally overvotes, you're going to override it so that the rest of the ballot can be read. Okay? So that's how you deal with overvotes. It could also be a situation, if the machine rejects the ballot, that your ballot could be blank. There have been occasions where a voter may check in, get their ballot, and then walk straight to the AccuVote machine and says, okay, I'm done. And you go, well, did you mark your ballot? No, I don't support any of these candidates or any of these positions. I just wanted to vote. Well, the machine will reject it as blank because it says you didn't mark the ballot. But if the voter insists that, no, I want to vote for a blank ballot, that's fine. Same procedure as overvote. You're just going to open up your security flap, hold yes, override the machine, and in the ballot goes. And the machine is going to just record all those races as blank. So again, you might run into that if you have a voter that insists on voting for a blank ballot, or if you are processing early or absentee ballots and for whatever reason the voter returned a blank ballot. That's fine. You just override and you put it in. Now, you might also run into a situation where the machine rejects the ballot and you see a message that says error. What that means is that there could be a printer's error on this one ballot. Sometimes, as you're printing all these ballots, there might be a stray mark or something like that, and the machine will reject it. In those situations, you're again just going to spoil that ballot, give the voter a new one, and then ideally that ballot will go through, and you'll take the spoiled ballot and put it in the spoiled ballot envelope. So again, if you're running into issues where the ballot's not going to the machine, check the LCD screen. There might be a message that's explaining what's going on. But let's say you've done all that. Let's say you've tried everything, and for whatever reason, the ballot is still not going into the machine. If you tried everything and the ballot is still not going into the machine, you're going to insert your ballot into the hand count slot on the side right here. Remember, hand count should always be your last resort. You should try to do everything in your power to get the machine to read the ballot, because every ballot you insert in hand count is going to have to be counted by hand at the end of the night because the machine didn't read it. So as a result, if you have a lot of hand counts, you may have to stay a long time to process all these ballots. And there may be ballots that you have to process by hand count. For instance, soldiers that are serving abroad can vote through a process known as UOCAVA, overseas ballots. And because they may be stationed abroad in areas where mail isn't easily accessible, they can vote by email. So here's an example of a UOCAVA ballot. And you may receive these on Election Day. And for UOCAVA ballots, you'll see that the voter printed it out and scanned it, printed it out, and emailed it back to us. And that's fine. That's a way they can vote. But because it's printed out like this, the machine can't read it. So this is an automatic hand count. You're going to have to hand count this at the end of the night. So because you might run into some hand counts, it's vitally important that you do everything in your power to try to make sure that you process every ballot you've got through your machine if possible. If you are running into a situation where the machine is just rejecting every ballot, call City Hall immediately. Something is wrong. Do not wait until the last minute to let us know that something's wrong and the machine isn't reading ballots. Again, these machines are programmed before the election. They should be accepting ballots. If for whatever reason your machine is rejecting every ballot you try to put into, call us immediately. Something is wrong. Do not keep inserting ballots into your hand count. We had an election a couple of years ago where, for whatever reason, even though the machine wasn't accepting ballots, the poll workers didn't inform City Hall that something was wrong. So as a result, at the end of the night, they had close to like 500, 600 ballots that you had to hand count at the end of the night. Suffice to say, we were there at the polling location until 1 in the morning, hand counting each of these ballots. You don't want to do that. That's why we have the machine. So again, hand count should be your last resort. And it's only if you try everything else to get that ballot in the machine. Okay, so next common scenario you may run into. the ballot's getting jammed. You may run into a situation where you insert a ballot into the machine and then it stops halfway, so it's jammed in the machine. Well, what do? Check your LCD screen. You may see one of two messages. It'll either say counted ballot jammed in reader or returned ballot jammed in reader. That instruction tells you what you need to do with the ballot. So, wardens and clerks, call your officer over, get the key, open the security flap. And then you're going to gently slide the machine out. Don't turn off the power, don't unplug it. By sliding it out, you're going to expose a small area here where you're going to see the ballot in between the machine and in the ballot slot, where it goes into the box. Now, those two messages. If the message says counted ballot jammed in reader, that means that the machine read the ballot and counted it, but for whatever reason it got jammed or stuck on the way into the ballot box. So in those situations, you're just going to gently take the ballot and slide it through and allow it to deposit into the ballot box. Because remember, the machine counted it. If the message says returned ballot jammed in reader, that means that the machine didn't read the ballot and it got jammed. So in those situations, let's say this is an example, you gently open it up, you see the ballot in there, just going to take the ballot by both sides and gently pull it out. Slide the machine back in, and then you're going to try to process it again. If the ballot keeps getting jammed and not read, spoil it, give the voter another one. So there might be something wrong with the ballot. Okay? Now, what if you've done that, but the ballots are still getting jammed in the machine? So let's say you keep trying to insert ballots into the machine, but they keep getting jammed or rejected. You could, and for the presidential election it might be likely, you may be in a situation where your ballot box has gotten so many ballots that they're just piled up so high that further ballots are getting jammed because there's no space for them to go into. So, to deal with this situation, you have start this first. This is the first thing you should do. Call your officer over, get your keys. You're going to take your keys and you're going to open up the back of your ballot box and expose that main area where all the machine-counted ballots go into. Once you open the back of your box, you're going to see all of these ballots piled up high. What you're then going to do is you're going to take your hand and you're just going to press down all the ballots in your ballot box. Reach your hand up, pull out any ballots that might be caught up on the top, and again, press all of your machine-counted ballots down and make more space. And once you've done that, you can re-secure the back, take your key, re-secure it, and then start feeding in more ballots. Now, it may be a situation where after you've done that several times, you've tried pressing it down, but you've just gotten so many ballots that there's just no more space and you can't press down anymore. That's fine. What you're going to do is you're going to, again, open up the back, and you're going to take one of your gray plastic bins. This is used to return your counted ballots to City Hall at the end of the night. But in the middle of an election, you could use them to securely store any ballots that you've counted already during Election Day so that they'll be ready to be processed at the end of the night. So, take your plastic bin, open up the back, and just take all of your counted ballots out and put them in the plastic box. Remember, do not mix your machine count and your hand count. Remember, don't mix those two. You're just taking your machine count out. So you take all the machine count ballots out that have already been counted by the machine. You've made space in the ballot box. You re-secure your ballot box. You take all of your ballots that have been put in here, close the top, and then you're going to secure your ballot box with a yellow security tab that's going to be in your kit. And this just makes sure that they're safe and no one can tamper with them. So you secure your ballot box on both sides. And then, wardens and clerks, you can either store this under your table or you can give it to the police officer so that they can monitor it until the end of the election. So that's a way you can make more space in your ballot box so you can accept more ballots. And again, if you're running into a situation where your AccuVote just keeps rejecting ballots, call City Hall immediately. We'll send a technician out and we'll deal with the situation. Okay, let's now go over some situations you might run into when you're checking in voters. So, let's use the first common situation. Let's say a voter comes into your check-in table, but when you find the voter in the check-in book, you discover an I underneath the box. Here's an example of what it looks like, an I. That I stands for inactive voter. An inactive voter are voters who are registered to vote, but they either haven't voted in a long time or they haven't responded to the city's local census. As such, we don't know if their address is current. So, inactive voters are still going to be permitted to vote. But prior to voting, they have to fill out an affirmation of current and continuous residence with the warden and clerk. So, inspectors, if you are checking in a voter and you see that I underneath the box, call over your warden and clerk. Because the warden and clerk are going to bring over their green binder, they're going to go into the materials, and they're going to pull out this form, the affirmation of current and continuous residence form. And with the inactive voter, they're going to fill out all the information. Warden, precinct, the voter's name, their street number, current address, the address where they're registered to vote, and the inactive voter is going to be asked to provide ID. Now, this is an important thing to remember. Massachusetts is not an ID state. So we, when we are checking voters in, do not ask voters to show ID. All a voter needs to provide when they're checking in is their name and address, and we check them in. We do not ask to see ID. Now, a voter can pro-offer ID if they wish. Sometimes you might have a voter for whom English is a second language, so they prefer to just show their driver's license. That's fine. If a voter pro-offers you ID, that's great. You can just look at, and again, look up the voter in the book and just repeat their name and address out loud. So you can accept ID if it's given to you by the voter, but we don't ask to see ID. Inactive voters is one of the few occasions where we will ask to see ID, though, when we are filling out the inactive affirmation. And what forms of ID are acceptable? Well, an acceptable form of ID will include the voter's name and the address where they are registered to vote. Acceptable forms of ID include a valid driver's license, a state-issued ID card, a current utility bill, bank statement, government check, or any other kind of government document that shows the voter's name and address and is current. Passports do not count because the passport does not have the voter's address on it. So, once the voter shows their ID, they then provide their signature and the election official puts their initials on it. And then clerks, remember, there's also a section in your clerk's report where you're going to note down inactive voters in there, like the time, name, and so forth. Now, what happens if an inactive voter doesn't have ID or fails to show it? That's fine. If the voter doesn't have ID, they can still be allowed to vote, but there's going to have to be administered an oath. And the oath is on the inactive affirmation sheet in English, Spanish, and Khmer. And the warden will ask the inactive voter to raise their right hand, and they'll just read off the sheet, okay? Inactive voter, do you swear and affirm that you do currently and have continuously lived in the city of Lowell since the date listed on the inactive voters list, or the date last listed as a voter? If they say, I do, they can vote. Now, keep in mind, this can be a situation where if an observer is watching you, they may say, I'm challenging that voter because they don't have ID. So again, the voter will be permitted to vote if they do the oath, but you might also have to note that it's a challenged voter. And we'll get into that in a bit. So again, once the voter either shows their ID or has administered the oath and they sign in right here in the form, they're all set. So the voter then checks in like normal. You check them in the book, you give them the ballot, they take the ballot, they mark it, and then they deposit their ballot in the AccuVote machine. So for inactive voters, they are treated just like regular voters, except that they have that extra step. They have to go do the inactive affirmation and show ID. Now, next common situation. You might run into a situation where you're checking a voter's name, but the voter isn't in the check-in, check-out list. So there may be times where the voter's name is not in the check-in, check-out book. At such time, inspectors should call over your warden and clerk and do the following. The first thing you should always check if a voter is not in your check-in, check-out book is you should check to see if the voter is a registered voter. Now, a voter may either have not registered or they may be registered to vote in a previous location and failed to register to vote in their new location, or it could be in a situation where they did register to vote, but they didn't register to vote in time for the November election. So the last day in which you can register to vote for November is October 24th, which is a Saturday. So if a voter registered to vote after October 24th, that's great, they registered to vote, but they didn't register to vote in time for November. So how can you check to see if a voter is registered? Well, the voter and the poll worker can check online if you've got a cell phone. You can go to the Massachusetts Secretary of State's website, and they have a section that says voter registration search. A voter can type in their information, and the state can look up the voter and see if they're registered to vote. What you can also do is you can call us at City Hall. We're going to have a phone bank active, so we're going to have poll workers that are going to be here at City Hall looking up voters on the computers, and then they can inform you if the voter is registered to vote. Now, you could also have a situation where the voter is registered to vote, but they just, they're registered to vote, but they're in the incorrect polling location. So it may be that they haven't voted in a while, they are registered to vote, but they forgot where they go. So they go to this location and say, I think I vote here, I'm not sure. So they are registered to vote, but they're in the incorrect polling location. Again, you can check that. So if the voter, or you, and your cell phone types in wheredoivote.ma.com, that'll take you to the Massachusetts Secretary of State's website, and you can check the voter's polling location. Again, you can also call us at City Hall. We can look up the voter, and not only if they're registered to vote, but where their correct polling location is. And we can tell you where the voter's correct polling location is. And again, our number is 978-674-4060. And we also will provide a phone bank number in the materials that you can call. So, what if the voter is in the wrong location? Well, if the voter is in the wrong location, they need to go to the correct location so that they can vote. Again, and the reason for that is that a voter has to check in at their polling location first before they be given the ballot to vote. And again, that makes sense. Voters can only vote once. So by law, they are required to check in before they be given a ballot. So if a voter is in the incorrect polling location, you need to do everything in your power to convince that voter to go to the correct polling location. So let's say they are in Ward 1, Precinct 1, they need to go to Ward 3, Precinct 1. Well, in that situation, tell them you need to go to this address at 3-1, and you can go there. If you need an address, you can look it up in the materials, or you can call us. We can give the address. We can give directions. If they need a GPS address, we can do that too. We will do everything we can to help the voter get to the correct polling location. If you need to look up, again, a polling location, wardens call the election office, we can help you. Okay? But again, you need to do everything in your power to convince the voter to go to the correct polling location. And that may mean that the voter might even have to leave the city if they're in the incorrect polling location. Again, you may run into a situation where a voter recently moved to Lowell, but they either forgot or they failed to register in Lowell. As such, their current voter registration information and their current address where they need to register to vote is their previous address. So as a result, they're going to have to, if they want to vote and check in, they got to go back to their previous community to vote. Now, there may be situations, such as the one I mentioned, where for whatever reason the voter either failed to register on time but still insists that they want to vote, or they're in the wrong polling location but for whatever reason can't get to the correct polling location and still want to vote. Now, in those rare circumstances and other similar circumstances, the voter is still going to be permitted to vote. It's a hard and fast rule and a procedure that we do not reject voters. We don't turn voters away. We allow voters to vote. But for these voters for whom they either didn't register on time or they're not registered for this area or they're in the incorrect polling location, they're going to be voting through a procedure called provisional voting. Provisional voting is voting of last resort. And this is done in those rare circumstances where the voter doesn't appear in the check-in, check-out book, but we're permitting them to vote because we don't turn voters away. But provisional voting isn't like regular voting or inactive voting. Because again, we don't know if the voter is registered to vote, or we know that they're not registered to vote, or they're in the incorrect polling location. So again, we don't turn voters away, but we aren't necessarily going to be accepting these ballots, because the Election Commission is going to have to review all of these ballots after the election and make a determination of whether they're going to accept or reject the ballots. And there may be circumstances where these provisional ballots are going to be rejected after the election, because again, it could be that the voter didn't register to vote, or they're in the incorrect polling location. Okay? So it's going to have to be determined on a case-by-case basis. So if you run into a situation where a voter is going to have to vote provisional ballot, we've set up provisional ballot kits that you can use. And wardens and clerks, if you run into a provisional ballot situation, you are going to be dealing with the voter, okay? So inspectors should direct the voter to you. In these blue binders, we have pre-made provisional ballot kits so that you can use these provisional ballot kits in conjunction with the forms in your green binder to process the voter. So, in the provisional ballot kits, they will include an envelope where the provisional ballot is going to go into after the voter voted. And stapled to the provisional ballot kits is the form that the provisional voter is going to need to fill out. They're going to need to fill out all this information, and they're going to need to sign and date it. And then the warden is going to fill out this information here. So what kind of election is it? Whether the voter provided ID. And that's another thing too. Provisional voters are going to need to provide ID as well. Whether they provide ID, the reason they're voting provisional, and other information here. And again, to make this easier, we pre-make these packages so you've got your ward and precinct here. And then in addition, we've attached a voter registration card. So the voter can register to vote right there on the spot so they don't have to go through provisional voting again. Once the voter has filled out all this information, and you fill out the provisional voting information in the green binder in your clerk's report and in the provisional intake sheet, that's again near the inactive sheets, the voter is going to be given their ballot. The voter then goes into the booth, marks their ballot, and then they're going to take that ballot and put it in the envelope and go back to the warden and clerk. Remember, provisional ballots do not go into the AccuVote machine because they got to be reviewed and either accepted or rejected after the election. So a voter that votes provisional puts their ballot in the envelope and they hand it to the warden and clerk. The warden and clerk will then take that provisional ballot and they're going to put that provisional ballot into this orange provisional ballot bag so that it can be stored and brought back to Lowell City Hall so it can be reviewed after the election. So again, remember, provisional ballots do not go in the AccuVote. Poll workers, if you see a voter who's voting provisional try to come up to you to insert it, you got to stop them. You got to remind them, take your ballot, put it in the envelope, and give it to the warden and clerk. Because those ballots are going to be secured and they're going to be put into the orange provisional ballot bag so that they can be counted after the election. Okay, so I'm going to briefly pause part 2 just so we can make sure that this video is going to be uploaded. And then when I come back, we're going to continue part 2, and we're going to go over absentee and early ballot processing, as well as other procedures that you're going to need to watch out on Election Day. So I'll see you in a few seconds.